If you're struggling to defend your design decisions at work, then this interview is going to change the way you think. Welcome to Writers of Silicon Valley. Hey everyone, welcome back to Writers of Silicon Valley. I'm Patrick Stafford. Now, look, I know I say this every time, but I am really excited about today's interview. My guest is Tom Greever. He wrote the book Articulating Design Decisions, and I recommend this book, I think, probably, more than any other design book. I think it's just so underrated, and I think the advice in it is perfect for anyone at any skill level. I think, defending your design decisions is something you have to do every day at work, but it's not something that a lot of people do really well. Certainly not something that I did very well early in my career. So I think this book contains just a huge amount of advice that is just fundamental to your design work. And that's what we talk about today. So I'm really excited to get to that. I would recommend you read it. Go and check out the link in the show notes. It's just a fantastic book, and the conversation veers a little bit around the book as well as what's in it. So I think we cover a lot of great topics like influence and, the whole getting a seat at the table thing that we all love to complain about. But I'm really excited about the interview. So look, nothing really to go on about. Before we start, just a reminder, you can get 20% off courses and workshops at UX Content Collective, and we have coaching now. So if you're interested in booking a time with a coach, go and check out the coaches there. They're ready and willing to spend time with you and talk about your portfolio or interview prep or anything else that you need. So that's it. So here's my interview with Tom Greever, author of the book Articulating Design Decisions. Really hope you enjoy it.
Really good balance for me.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I think the thing that I miss is some people hate this. I really enjoy small talk with people.
Sure.
I really enjoy gossip, And so one of the things that I really miss right now is that I don't get any office gossip. Like usually, you would speak to someone and I would say, "Oh, what are you doing tonight?" And they'd say, "Oh, I'm going on a date or something." And then you'd see them the next day. You'd be like, "Oh, how'd it go?" And you get those sorts of stories and stuff. Right now, I get nothing. So anytime someone tells me any piece of gossip or anything like that, I'm just like, give me everything because I want to know what's going on.
Well, it's true. Like when you're in an office, you can have those serendipitous moments that you wouldn't otherwise, just remotely. I mean, you can have them remotely. You just have to be more intentional about reaching out to people and checking in and seeing how they're doing. Right. And it feels a bit more formal than if you just bumped into someone in the hallway. But yeah, I always enjoy when I am in the office getting to bump into someone and have a casual conversation. And, sometimes it's like, oh, that person that was on a Zoom call that I never really get to interact with. Now, all of a sudden I get to kind of meet them face to face for the first time and make that, human connection. I do think it is valuable for improving relationships when you actually get to meet someone face to face. But I think it's possible to have both, right? I think it's possible to do a little bit of both and to kind of get the benefits.
Yeah. Why did you decide to write this book? Because I think it is one of the, most underrated skills in a designer's toolkit, being able to actually defend what it is that you're doing and explain why. What led you to write it?
Yeah, so originally I was asked to submit some talk ideas for a conference that was local to me where I live in the US. And, just the process of thinking through what I might give a talk on at a conference, it was a little bit of kind of a brainstorming session. And I submitted 3 different ideas, 2 of which really interested me and I thought was super interesting. And the third one was this thing called Articulating Design Decisions, which at the time seemed like, okay, yeah, there's definitely, I had definitely experienced in my career designers that I'd worked with on my own team who had done really well in their careers at kind of getting their work seen, approved, getting kind of the accolades that come with, the outcomes of great work. And other designers who seemed to be really talented, but just for whatever reason weren't as good at kind of like getting their work, seen and out there. And so I kind of pondered like the reasons for that. And so it became, this talk, Abstract for Articulating Design Decisions. But at the time when I submitted it, I thought, well, this isn't very interesting. This is something that all designers have to do like pretty much every day, right? I mean, this is just like part of the job is learning to articulate your design decisions. So it didn't seem to me at the time like something that would be very interesting to people because it was so kind of mundane and just a part of the job, right? Naturally, that's the topic that the conference chose and asked me to give a talk on. And so now I was given this task of like, oh, okay, well, how do I break this down for other people to learn from? Like if I look at my own experiences and people I've worked with and the ways in which I've tried or failed to do this well, how could I kind of like build a framework around it in such a way that it would help other people who aren't me maybe learn from my own experiences and the ways that I've tried to approach this problem in the past. And so that started as a conference talk. I gave that same talk at another conference a little bit later, and O'Reilly was a sponsor of that second conference, and they asked me if I would turn it into a book. But what I didn't anticipate was the response from the audiences at the time. So this was my first time speaking at a conference, and both conferences where I gave this talk, it was genuinely difficult for me to get my stuff together and like leave the stage and walk out of the room because so many people were coming up and asking me questions and saying, oh, this is a problem that I've had. And here's how I've dealt with, like, there was so much interest in kind of like talking about it that like they had to like usher me out so they could get the other speakers in and like set up microphones and all of that. Like I didn't anticipate that. That was my first time ever speaking at a conference. And I realized that I had struck on something that, first of all, was genuinely a problem for everyone. Like it was something that everyone kind of universally struggled with, but it seems to have kind of like touched on almost this like emotional chord for folks, because here we're talking about, receiving, processing feedback from people that sometimes appears to be directed at us or about our expertise or our worth or our value as designers. And it makes it kind of intensely personal in that way. And so I think the idea of kind of like having an approach, right? Like having some ways of thinking about this problem that allowed us to set aside that ego and kind of like think about it a bit more objectively, break it down into multiple steps. It ended up being something that was very useful for people in a way that I didn't fully anticipate, but has been a blast to be a part of.
So for UX writers and content designers, they typically have been very interested in writing and reading for a long time. So not just,
Sure.
In a design context, but they write fiction or they're journalists or copywriters. I was a journalist, and so that's my background.
Yeah.
And for a lot of the time, you when you write things, you tend to just have a feel for it, right? You tend to just think like, oh, this sounds good because of the rhythm of the speech, or maybe there's alliteration, or a few different techniques. And for a lot of people, it is very difficult to then have to sit in a design context and say, why did you choose this word, or why did you do this, or why did you do that? And of course, it's the same for designers, right? If you come from a visual background and you do a lot of artistry or something like that, it can be very difficult to say, it just looks cleaner, right? So how do you start developing a framework or maybe some practices for actually starting to defend and explain why you're making the decisions that you are?
Yeah. And I think the way that you've described it there is really helpful, because that's typically what happens to people when they become an expert in something. They move from being conscious of everything that they're doing when you're first starting out and learning those new skills and trying to figure out how to be the writer or the designer or whatever it is. And eventually those skills become more or less automatic, right? We don't have to think about them as much. We become much more efficient at using what some people would call intuition. And I think that's probably true. But most of the time, that intuition is based on past experiences that we had where we tried something and it didn't work and we learned from it. And those learnings become kind of like automatic, right? And so, as you described, it can be very difficult to help someone else understand that decision-making process when we ourselves don't even realize that we're doing it, right? And so when those decisions become made subconsciously, it takes a lot more effort to connect the dots between what you did and why you did it, and then to help someone else understand it, right? And so the solution and the answer to your question there is that those practices involve anything that is going to help us connect the dots between what's happening up here and how we can explain it to someone else. And for me, I have found that just simply trying to write down my explanations. In the book, I talk about kind of the big three questions: what problem does this solve? How does this affect the user? Why is it better than the alternative? Those, for me, have been kind of foundational questions that force me to think through the decisions that I made in a way that first, if I can explain it to myself first, then I'll be better prepared to explain it to someone else. But it kind of like helps me break down that process. But also, it's just about being aware of the decisions you're making while you're making them. If the problem is that we're not aware and we're just kind of letting our minds kind of like do the work, then part of the solution to that then is pausing every so often to think about, okay, I moved this from here to there, or I chose these words instead of those other words. Why is that? Like, how might I help someone else understand my thinking? And it's still incredibly difficult to do, but I think those habits of kind of like writing it down and forcing yourself to pause and kind of think critically about why you did what you did is sort of the first step in that process.
When I started as a journalist right out of university, I started at a publication and I was very, very green and, didn't really know what I was doing, just like anyone at a new role. And every morning I would have to submit my pieces, and my editor would open my work on a screen, and he would sort of point beside him and say, okay, stand here. And then he would look at the screen and he would go through line by line and he would say, why did you put this here? Why did you use this word? What did you do this? And why did you do this? Why is this here? Do we have more of this? Why didn't you speak to this person? And at the beginning, it's incredibly scary. And obviously that tends not to happen in like a design context. It's a very sort of rigorous sort of journalistic approach. But it really does put you on the spot and force you to start thinking through absolutely every decision that you're making, and not just doing things through, as you mentioned, intuition, but then being able to explain it. I actually think that this is why I'm a little bit afraid people are relying on AI too much, because you brought up the idea of writing things down. Like, writing to me is thinking. Like, it's a great way of just sitting there and going, why am I doing this? And in the context or in the approach of doing that, you may actually change some things. You may write things down and go, you know what? That's not a great reason for doing this. I should approach something in a different way, or I shouldn't do that, or something like that. So yeah, I'm a little bit afraid that we're kind of losing that art.
Well, and I have found that even just reading things aloud, like my own explanations aloud, or trying to verbally describe a design decision that I made to someone else, like just as a practice, right? Like, it's not uncommon for me to stand here in my office by myself, kind of practicing a presentation, or when I'm out, jogging, kind of like running through the thinking in my mind, because now I'm kind of like not hindered by the screen or the words, right? I can just allow my mind to think and process those things. And often when I do that, I start to hear things and see things differently. I start to, as those words and the ideas start to take shape in my mind, I recognize patterns, right? And why I did what I did that make it easy to explain. Or perhaps I even uncover things that I forgot about, that I should have included, that I didn't, right? But either way, like that process of thinking through it, whether verbally or writing it down, putting it in any kind of different form is going to help me think through the problems that I'm solving and how I can help other people. I do think, by the way, that content design is in many ways a trickier space to do this than, say, visual design. And primarily because people know words. They can use and choose their own words that they may think are better. Everyone that we work with is writing and speaking on some level or another, right? But not everyone that we work with is designing the boxes and rectangles that designers do to create the interfaces, and probably couldn't do that even if they wanted to. Now, they may be able to look at an interface design and tell me what they like or don't like and tell me their opinions, and that's fine. But when it comes to language and content, it becomes a much more difficult challenge, I think, to defend those choices and to help someone else understand it when that other person theoretically has kind of the same command of the language and the similar tools that you have to be able to create the same kind of thing, right? But what I love about the example that you gave there is with that editor is that if you know that that's the environment that you're going into, and especially if you've done it once or twice, you kind of know what to expect. That should actually give you some really good clues about how you can better prepare. Okay, I know what kinds of questions this person is going to ask, right? I'm positive they're going to ask me about this word versus that because it came up last week, right? And like over time, as you get to know people, and especially as you get to kind of understand what makes them tick and those patterns that they obsess over, it becomes a lot easier then to know and to anticipate how to address them in the moment.
Some of the ways to defend your design decisions in content design are easy, right? I chose this word because the users chose that word, and so we're reflecting the user language. Or I chose this term because it's industry standard and we have to do it legally, right? Like those sorts of kind of gimmies. But when it comes to the more ambiguous stuff, I tend to find it's a little bit like music, where you might do something and people go, "Why'd you do that?" I don't know. It sounded good, Like you tend to get into a rhythm, and sometimes there are spaces for that where you just go, look, I made a creative decision and I feel like it sounds like this. But I think your example of writing things down and explaining it to someone who maybe has no context is a good way of approaching it. But I want to talk about a couple of other things, because I think so much of your book is not just about defending your specific decisions, but also creating an environment where people not only understand where you're coming from, so like properly setting expectations and so on, but also being able to project yourself in a way where you can really, I suppose, inspire confidence, or you can portray the confidence you have in your own decisions. And so part of that is obviously having confidence in yourself. But I'm really passionate about this topic because for a lot of content designers, the main complaint is they don't have enough influence. The phrase everyone uses is, I don't have a seat at the table, and so on. And I think I mentioned earlier, one of the things I love about the book is that it's so much about persuasion, not manipulation. It's persuasion, being able to persuade people. And one of the really big things you talk about in the book is seeking the perspective of your stakeholders. So going out and finding, what are they looking for? What do they prioritize? And I really think it's an underrated skill. Because if you go into a meeting understanding, well, where is this person coming from? What is their motivation? What are they trying to achieve? The way you defend your decisions is going to change based on that approach. I'm wondering if that's something you agree with, the way I just described it, or you have a different view.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, a lot of the people that we work with are going to see different values when it comes to, UX or content or research, right? They're going to see the value that we bring to the organization differently. And if I can understand that perspective, then it becomes a lot easier for me to deliver that kind of value to them. And when I deliver that value, it gives them the confidence that they really understand, like, my team's role, the way that we provide that value. Now, maybe it's also true that the way that they see us and perceive us in the team isn't where I want it to be, right? We don't have that seat at the table, or we want to have more influence. That's okay too, because once I build that trust, I have the opportunity then to help inform and influence their perspective of me or my work or my team's work over time, right? And I think I don't think we need to expect that people will automatically understand the value that we bring, or even understand it from in the way that we think we should bring it. I think that influence comes through providing value to build trust, right? And then informing and kind of influencing that perspective over time. And so there's kind of two tracks that we have to play there, right? Where we have to understand what the value is that we're providing, how we're perceived in the organization today, and we also have to have an understanding of like how we want to get to where we want to go, so that we can have more influence, so we can inspire more confidence in people. And that takes longer, right? It's more of a long-term play, but it's necessary. No one is going to just invite us into the room and give us that seat at the table, right? It's something that we kind of always have to be earning and working for.
I completely agree with you. I really get frustrated with the approach of like, well, yes, by nature of your position, yes, you should be included in some things. But to me, like, the better result would be if you're not in a room, people asking, where's Tom? Where's Patrick? They should be here. You know what I mean? And so the way you do that is through, as you just said, like proving your value, understanding where people are coming from. And I think articulating decisions is a big part of that. One interesting thing I really liked about your book is that you talk about charm and confidence, and being able to project that confidence, which is a hard thing for some people. I think there are some people who perhaps naturally have that confidence in their decisions, and I think for some people, a lot of people, it's practiced. I think for content designers, the majority of whom, according to our surveys, are actually identifies female. And something I've heard from a lot of people, a lot of content designers, is they're in a room with a bunch of guys and they find it actually a little bit intimidating, and perhaps especially at that younger level where you're a little bit younger, a little bit earlier in your career, that confidence can be hard to develop. Can you talk a little bit about how you approach confidence in the book, and maybe some advice for people who are in that situation?
Yeah, so I'll admit this was actually kind of one of the more difficult topics to address in the book, because I think there is a lot of room for interpretation in terms of like how you believe this could like play out in your own life. And certainly my experience is one of many, right? And exactly how people choose to apply this to their scenarios, I think, is going to vary greatly. And so it was a tricky thing to be able to describe this idea that like having confidence is about having confidence in yourself, right? In your own expertise and the ideas that you bring to the table. And I think most of us, if we really stop and think about it, we are able to have confidence in our skills, right? And in the decisions that we've made. It can be more difficult to communicate that to people, especially if you feel like you're in a room where there are people who have more experience than you, or at a different level in the organization, or like whatever the dynamics might be in the room. It can be more difficult to communicate that confidence in those environments. And so one of the things I talk about is that I refer to it as acting your way into a new way of thinking, where sometimes you just have to know that you are confident in yourself and your own expertise, and you have to do your best to take on that persona and communicate that confidence in those rooms, and that it might feel maybe like a bit of false confidence, maybe even a little bit disingenuous, but it ultimately can resolve itself into actually being confident in the moment. And I think people tend to respond better to us when we communicate that sense of confidence about what we did, right? And I think everyone kind of like has the opportunity to practice that. But I'll admit that I know that it can be difficult for some people to kind of like find that right balance of being able to, remain humble, right? To be considerate of the other folks who are in the room, but also communicate the confidence that they need to really get their message across. It's a very difficult thing to practice and to.
It's funny. I work with a bunch of people in a team, and often I will ask them, why did you make this decision? And it's not necessarily even in a design context. It'll be something related to customer service or something like that. And I've experienced this thing where as soon as I ask a question, the response sometimes is for them to go, oh, we can just do it your way. It's fine. It's fine. And I have to say to them, I'm not saying we shouldn't do it your way. I'm just asking you, why did you do it this way? I'm giving you a chance to explain your thinking. But I think for a lot of people, like their immediate response is to sort of maybe back down and as soon as they're questioned and to say, oh, no, it's fine. We can sort of do it your way. But once they actually have and I sort of encourage them, I say, no, explain to me why you've done this. I'm curious. Then they can go, oh, well, I did it because of X, Y, Z. I did it because of this. And I'm like, okay, that sounds great. Let's do that. But I think for some people, even just the nature of being questioned about something can be very intimidating for them.
Right. And I think we miss an opportunity when we assume that questions are, an attack, for lack of a better word, on kind of like our expertise and our choices. I think there's almost always an opportunity to have a conversation and to have a discussion. And if you automatically assume that those questions mean that it was a wrong choice, then you're not going to have that confidence. And so much of it is about just having a mindset shift of assuming that there is always an opportunity for us to talk about this. An example that comes to mind for me is I had someone on my team once who had received a slide deck. This was a designer who had a peer in product, and their product partner had sent them a slide deck of what they thought the roadmap should be for like the upcoming quarter. Well, the designer on my team read it as the product person telling them what to do. Like, hey, here's the roadmap, go deal with it. Right. And they came to me saying like, oh, this is I can't believe this. Like they're just telling me what the roadmap is going to be. They're not asking for my opinion. They're not interested in what I have no influence here. And I was like, do you not have any influence? Like, have you talked to them about it? Like, cause I think you're assuming that they're just dropping it on your doorstep, but that may not be the case at all. I said, why don't you go back to them with the assumption that you do have influence and start asking them some questions about the roadmap and see where it goes. And sure enough, they went back to them and started asking some questions. And the product owner's response was like, oh yeah, I mean, this was my first draft. This is my first pass. I was sharing it with you early. I would love your feedback. I'd love for us to like get together and talk through this. Right. But if my designer hadn't made that assumption, right, and I hadn't had the opportunity to kind of like help process and think through that, they would have missed that opportunity for influence. And so sometimes I think we do it to ourselves, right? When we kind of like make those assumptions that we don't have influence, it doesn't give us the confidence that we need to really go after those conversations. And then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in that way, because then we really don't have kind of like the influence that we think we need to have in those conversations.
A lot of this work isn't really design work. It's relationship work, right? Like it's going to people and saying, hey, what did you, want from me for this? What sort of feedback are you looking for? I'm wondering if you have advice for people about, setting those expectations and what it means to do that before you even get to the articulating your decision stage.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, a lot of it goes back to that mindset that we talked about a minute ago, where, I need to see everything for the opportunity that it is. right? And if I'm really kind of like looking for opportunity, and by the way, there is always opportunity in change and in indecision and ambiguity, right? And I think sometimes we take those signals, the change, ambiguity, and we kind of we miss the opportunity to really influence the outcomes in a way that I think can be super healthy, right? And so one thing that I try to practice myself is to always look for the opportunity to kind of assume the best about the people around me, and that they are busy. They're not necessarily the best at setting expectations, or they're doing their part of the job and then kind of like handing it off to other folks, right? That doesn't mean that there isn't an opportunity for me to make a recommendation or ask a good question or understand kind of like the level of fidelity of that work. And so first, if I just like take that approach, kind of like that mental state of believing that I do have the opportunity here to influence the outcomes or to participate in the process, even if I'm not being explicitly asked, then that puts me in a much healthier place of like helping people understand expectations. So like another example that comes to mind for me recently is that we had an executive who, sent out a document that said like, hey, here's the process, right? This is what from here on out, this is how our teams are going to operate, and this is how we're going to make decisions together. Well, it was very obvious to me that there were kind of maybe implied, but probably some steps missing for how I would expect our UX teams to be involved in this process, right? And it would have been easy for me to be like, oh, gosh darn, ho hum, like we don't have the seat at the table. They're just like telling us what to do, right? But instead, I made the assumption that there was an opportunity for us to set expectations about how we believe UX and design functions inside this organization. And so instead of just taking it at face value, I added a comment to the document. I went back to that executive and I said, hey, it sounds like, there's an implied step in here that isn't explicit. I'd like to suggest that UX own kind of this portion of that process. Well, naturally, this executive was thrilled to have engagement and enthusiasm about the process that they were trying to roll out. And the fact that I wanted me and my team to now be engaged in improving it and making it better and even participating in the documentation around it was actually a net positive for us in the organization, right? And so just by believing the best, kind of like looking for those opportunities, I was able to set expectations more broadly about how UX and design works in an organization. I have to take responsibility for that for myself, for my teams, and the designers on my team need to do it with their product peers as well, right? But you can't do that if you go into it with kind of like the wrong assumptions, the wrong mindset about how it all works and how people are thinking about you or your own work or your own participation in the process. Often they aren't, and it's up to us to take responsibility for that.
Your story reminds me, there was a time where my report was upset about something that he had been sent, and it was, I can't remember the specifics of it, but it was essentially like he got a direction or a piece of feedback from this other department, and they were doing something, and he was like, oh, they're doing this wrong and blah blah blah. And I'm like, well, have you spoken to this person? And they said, oh no, I can't do that. And I was like, why not? Like, why can't you go speak to that person who's 2 levels above you or whatever? I think for a lot of persuasion or influence, a lot of the confidence we talked about comes from maybe realizing that there are no invisible barriers. And sometimes when we enter an organization, we put up these invisible barriers in our mind that perhaps don't exist anywhere organizationally. We might think, well, I can't speak to that person because they're powerful, or I can't speak to that person because they're important. You can just talk to people and you can just point out. And one of the phrases I like to use in a lot of things is, hey, thank you for sending this out. Thank you for doing this. Are you open to feedback? I have a couple of suggestions if you're open to it. And 9 out of 10 times, people will go, absolutely, I want feedback. Please give it to me. And so I think that confidence is built by just just emailing, just talking to people, taking
Sure.
that step, not being abrupt or not being pushy necessarily, but just being direct. Thank you for this. Are you open to feedback?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's funny because I see this happening on my teams as well, where, people, I do think sometimes people over index on the levels and the job titles that people have, right? The people at higher levels of the organization, they're just like you, right? Like in many ways, they may even, suffer from kind of like the same lack of confidence, right? No matter where you are in the organization. And I had a designer on my team once who had started out the project designing things very much like within kind of like the scope and expectations of what we talked about at the beginning and what was written in the product requirements. And by the end of the project, it looked very different. And we had to go back and kind of like make some corrections because the experience really wasn't right. And I knew this designer to be a talented designer. And so when it came time to kind of like look back on that and reflect and provide feedback and like ask them about it, they said, oh well, in my meetings it's between like a director of product and a VP of engineering. It's like the three of us kind of like riffing on this stuff, and it was really hard to feel like I had the opportunity to, in their words, push back on someone who was a VP or a director. But in reality, that was the triad, right? That was product engineering and UX coming together to collaborate on what the final solution was. And the UX designer is still expected to kind of be the expert in that domain, right? And I don't think that the VP of engineering or the director of product ever thought to themselves or even realized or recognized that this person had a level of discomfort, that if a VP was going to say something, that it was going to be received or land on them as like a mandate, like something that they had to do. Right? They're trying to be a part of the team too. They're trying to collaborate as peers and as partners at the same level. And I think sometimes we over-index on those titles and what they mean in those conversations where the roles are maybe kind of like a little bit less distinct, and we want to be sure that we're doing a good job in front of people that we perceive to be our leaders. But the reality is that doesn't mean that we don't have the opportunity to continue to influence and participate in the outcomes.
Yeah, it's a hard one, right? Because like you need a level of confidence to be able to I don't want to say butt in, but to be able to speak up and say, have we considered this or whatever? And I also think there's a responsibility on the part of leaders to notice perhaps if someone isn't saying something and being able to say, Tom, what do you think about this? Or, we'd love your input or something like that. So I think it goes sort of back and forth.
It does, and often I do think people, and especially like at executive levels, and certainly when you get into like the people at the highest levels of the organizations, CEOs and whatnot, I don't think they even realize the weight of their words sometimes in a room, right? I think sometimes they themselves want to be a part of the team, right? They see themselves as like collaborating with everyone else in the room, and they don't even realize that sometimes people do respond quite seriously to something that from their perspective, they were just riffing, they were just brainstorming, they were just having an idea, not realizing that other people in the room are saying to themselves, oh gosh, when that, now we have to go do it that way.
I just had the most random thought, but I'm a big fan of Lord of the Rings, and there's a behind the scenes clip where they're making Lord of the Rings and Peter Jackson's talking to the CGI people, and he's like throwing out ideas about like, oh, maybe there's a cave troll in this shot, and he picks something up, he throws it over here, and he's clearly just like putting ideas out there, and he leaves the room, and all the artists put their heads in their hands, and they're just like, oh my god, like what's gonna happen? And it just reminds me of just so many times where you've had a leader in a room and they've said something, and then it's been taken at like face value, and then later on they say, oh, that was just a suggestion, like I didn't mean you had to do that. So I think you're right, like. And especially one thing that I had to realize becoming a senior and a lead and having people under me is people respond to mood as well. And the mood and the emotional tension in a room can affect your ability to defend decisions ultimately, because that type of environment can really affect your level of confidence. And so you may think to yourself, actually, it's not worth me defending this decision because it's going to piss this person off or whatever. There's definitely like an emotional aspect to this that plays into it.
Yeah. Well, and we talk about setting expectations, right? Like if people aren't doing a good job of setting expectations for us, like if you really do have kind of like the Peter Jackson coming in and telling you all the things, that they think you should do, it's not inappropriate to ask them like what their expectations are of like what the next steps are, even in the form of like a recommendation, right? Even if you're just saying like, okay, hey, thanks, Peter, those cave trolls sound awesome. I don't think that fits with what we're trying to do right now. So let me tell you what we're going to do next. I'm going to follow up on this thing. We're going to go back to as a team and discuss these other 3 things, and we'll let you know what we decided. But if there's something there that you feel strongly about, then like, let's talk about it. But otherwise, we're going to do our jobs as the experts in these domains to make the decisions that we think are the right things. And we would love for you to help us understand the parts of that you definitely want to be involved in, right? Because you feel strong, and the areas where you don't. But otherwise, we're gonna take this as your feedback, and we're gonna file it in a way that we feel like is appropriate given kind of like the scope or the constraints or the project itself, right? And I think anyone would appreciate that you want to take the time to understand like how much of what you just said is really important. Like how much of that do we need to like respond to or follow up on? Because I genuinely do want to follow up on those things. And I can't do that if I don't know what you're expecting.
So much of just avoiding problems is just asking anticipatory questions, like when would you like to see the next version of this? How much would you like to see, all that sort of stuff. Yeah. So I think as we sort of come to the end here, and I always think these times fly by because we're having such a great conversation. Well, what do you think are some of the underrated skills that content designers specifically should develop to help them when they're sort of defending their designs and when they're speaking to people and critique and being able to build that confidence?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do think that developing these skills, I mean, it's the same for content designers as it is for any other designer or researcher, right? It really is just about being more intentional about how you represent your work, right? So planning ahead, a lot of what we've talked about, anticipating how people might react, organizing your thoughts better, writing down, why you did what you did, like all of those things are good habits to have. But also like just practicing it, like actually making it a habit. I think sometimes we misunderstand that this is a skill that you can build and become good at and then never have to work at again. But it really is a habit. It's a practice. It's like exercise, right? The more that you do it, the easier it gets, the better you become at doing that thing. And, we can find opportunities to practice in lower risk environments, with our peers before we go into that meeting, just walking around and verbally, explaining it to ourselves to kind of uncover our thinking. Those are great ways for us to practice. But I think not falling into that trap of believing like, hey, I've been doing this for 20 years. I'm already good at it, right? No, it's a muscle that we need to continue to develop. It's hygiene, right? It's something that we have to continuously work at, I think, to keep sharp.
Awesome. Tom, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for spending time talking about your book, Articulating Design Decisions, and I'll link to it in the show notes. Is there anything that you would like to promote, or where can people find you online?
Yeah, I mean, my name is Tom Greever, and as far as I can tell, I'm the only one. So if you just Google my name, I'm pretty easy to find. I am most active on LinkedIn, and I have a website at tomgreever.com. And yeah, I mean, you can get the book wherever you get books.
Awesome. Tom, thank you so much for today. This has been great.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick.